Hi. So I just want to say a few words on the verdict of the so-called Colston Four. Um, I say so-called because sometimes when you have these sort of epithets, it can create kind of martyrs out of people, and I think these four don't deserve it. I mean that's been the case throughout social history. I'm thinking of the Chicago Seven, and there's other examples. The Birmingham Six during the Troubles. But in this case, the Colston Four. Little bit of background of the case if you're not familiar. It's well known in the UK, but if you're not familiar, basically in 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests, a group of activists, incidentally all of them white, um, decided to topple the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. So they toppled the statue, it was spray painted, and then they threw it into Bristol Harbour. I've only been to Bristol once. It was quite a while back, 2005, but I do recall that at that time there were a lot of public buildings in Bristol named after him. Basically, Edward Colston was a prominent merchant and philanthropist in the city, and he also benefited from the transatlantic slave trade. Hence, he was the target of these protests. But there's no question about it. It was an act of vandalism and wanton destruction. Now, the purpose of this video is not to defend Edward Colston. Um, I think anyone with a reasonable moral compass would accept that there was a lot of prominent men of that time who did benefit from an evil trade. And I don't think anyone would argue that the transatlantic slave trade wasn't evil. Of course it was. It was the exploitation of human beings as cattle, as commodities, literally commodities. And many died on the crossing, and of course they were treated appallingly in the plantations. I mean, I don't need to give a history lesson because it is so well documented. That's actually part of my point. The transatlantic slave trade is by far the most documented and discussed slave trade, but it's not the only one. The sad reality is slavery has existed in various forms throughout history and in most civilizations. Um, and it exists today. It exists today. But before I get into that, a few words about the verdict. I can't rationalize it. I can't understand why it was that people who were obviously involved in this, um, how they could be found not guilty of vandalism. Maybe there's some nuances to the case that only the jury heard. I don't know. But I do wonder, was it because a lot of their supporters were there? I don't want to get into conspiracy theories. I don't want to speculate when I wasn't there. But if it's the case that the judge was kind of appeasing the mob that had gathered there to support these four defendants, that's very troubling. I don't know. It just seemed to be a very strange verdict. I mean, I'm very critical of our justice system anyway, but to have a case that is clear cut, we have four defendants who were so centrally involved in a very publicly, filmed act of destruction. This wasn't like late at night where their identities weren't known. It was in broad daylight and their identities were known. Um, the evidence was overwhelming. So I don't understand it. I don't understand that. But more importantly, I'm concerned about the message it sends out. Because if they've been cleared, any left wing activist or any activist for that matter can now say, well, they were cleared, so I can do this. And the potential for action is endless. I mean, at that time, actually, in Sunderland, we have a statue of General Henry Havelock in our Central Park here. Henry Havelock was one of the commanders during the Indian Mutiny of 1857. He was obviously targeted as a symbol of the British Empire. I believe what happened in mid 2020 was a sort of attempted, and I say this, loosely speaking, an attempted cultural revolution. I'm not suggesting it was the same as what happened in China in the 60s. People weren't being murdered en masse, but it was a sort of attempt at cultural purification. I do believe that. I don't think that's hyperbole. I do believe that's what it amounted to. And it's still going on in various forms. I mean, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign is an example, but there's many other examples. Basically, any symbol of the British Empire, any symbol of any loose connection to slavery, street names being changed now. There is a sort of schism in society. On one hand, you have these very left wing woke activists, and I'm saying woke as part of their own vernacular to be awoken, right? They're woke activists who are demanding all these changes on one hand, and then you have, I would say, the majority of ordinary people who are sick of feeling that the entire reputation of this country is under attack. Um, and you have movements of resistance against that. So Sheffield City Council, I believe, went back on the decision to rename streets when locals protested it. And similar things have happened elsewhere because in some cases the connections are very, very loose anyway. Um, I believe in Liverpool there was an attempt to rename Strawberry Fields of made famous by the Beatles song. Supposedly, no, excuse me, it wasn't Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane. It turned out that it had nothing to do with the transatlantic slave trade. Someone made some loose connection, which turned out to be a false lead. So um, I think there is pushback, which is good. But Bristol is an interesting city. It's a city that has a long history of dissent and riots. So it might just be something in the cultural history of Bristol. Last year, the beginning of last year, there were serious riots in Bristol at the time of the Priti Patel's bill. I forget the formal name of it now, but it's a city that has a long history of protest and unrest. Perhaps it's just something in the character of Bristol, more so than other cities. Maybe not the good people of Bristol if they're watching this and comment. But I do feel some concern at what sort of message it sends out. I mean, think of the possibilities. There's a statue of Gandhi in Leicester. Now, Gandhi, although widely admired, has in more recent years his legacy's been controversial because he purportedly had racist views about black people. Nelson Mandela, well, Mandela advocated for violence. Again, another figure that's widely admired, but um, Mandela, unlike Gandhi, did take up the armed struggle. He later, of course, worked very hard in the reconciliation program in South Africa, for which he's rightly credited, but he was part of the armed struggle. Now, what if someone who believes that the ANC is a terrorist group, or was a terrorist group, then decides to vandalize a Mandela statue? I believe there's a Mandela statue in London. Um, the Karl Marx tomb in Highgate Cemetery has been targeted in the past by right-wing activists. Um, but this could go on and on and on. And it's a free for all, basically. So I do not understand this judgment, and I think it sends out a bad message. But on the issue of slavery, um, the transatlantic slave trade is well documented. What about the Barbary slave trade? Now, in the late 17th century, Barbary pirates operating in North Africa, also part of the Ottoman Empire, literally enslaved white Europeans. They were from Italy, they were from the southern coast of Britain and Ireland, but they were white European slaves. And often what happened was there was ransom money paid out. And this wasn't just a small, brief event. This happened over quite a long period of time. I have a big painting, it's actually a print, it's not the original painting. It's called Siege of Algiers, and it's set during the Barbary Wars. And basically, what happened was European powers had enough of it, and they took action against these Barbary pirates. Um, but what you had here was pirates many of them of African descent, North African descent, albeit, enslaving white Europeans. Now, why is that not better documented, or rather better known in the public mind? After all, British people were victims of this. Where's the memorials for that? Where's the discussion of that? Um, so I think that needs to be looked at. Other slave trades. Um, Certainly today, some of the worst countries for exploitation of other human beings are within Africa. And it's true that when you look at market economics, when you look at how it, goes through the system, we've all heard about blood diamonds. In Congo, you get child miners. Things like this, it's incredibly cruel and incredibly corrupt, but very often it's happening in African countries. Um, so there is a power dynamic at play there. When the transatlantic slave trade was going on, it was, after all, a trade. It was an evil trade, but it wasn't a case the Europeans came in and just took black Africans and that was it. They were traded. And the fact of the matter is, African chieftains were selling their fellow Africans into bondage. Now, why is that fact constantly downplayed or outright ignored? I'm fed up of the dishonesty around this. Um, it matters because when that is ignored, it's just part of the narrative of the evil white man came in and took slaves, rather than it was an evil trade of which white Europeans were certainly centrally complicit, but so were Africans. Now, when you get these Pan-Africanistic, excuse me, historians, I was going to say dictators there, but they defend African dictators. Anyway, when you get these historians, they come out with, oh, Britain needs to be honest about the slave trade, etc., etc. But they're not honest. They're not entirely honest about the role of Africans in that. And if you even dare say that, then you're accused of downplaying the whole thing. But it's about looking at the whole picture. Um, and I think it does matter. Because if you don't look at the whole picture of something, how can you have an honest assessment? I do think we should be honest about the transatlantic slave trade. I think we should be honest about the fact that cities like Bristol and Liverpool became wealthy as a result. But Britain was one of the first major powers to abolish slavery. And when we did, this is another fact that's forgotten. For much of the 19th century, the Royal Navy literally patrolled the world's oceans, intercepting slave ships. Sometimes our sailors at risk to their own lives. Um, that's just the reality. Again, it's a fact that's downplayed. In fact, there was a special unit of the Royal Navy, I forget the name now, but it was specifically tasked with patrolling slave ships. So I've no problem with people saying that Britain benefited from the slave trade and that was complicit in the build-up of our empire. But I think we should look at the whole picture. And I also think that those who are most vocal about the transatlantic slave trade in terms of, Britain and America being honest about it, they have nothing to say about slavery today or very little to say about that. I mean, where's their condemnation of slavery in Libya and Mauritania? Officially, it might be illegal, but it goes on. I've seen figures suggesting that there may be as many as 27 million slaves in the world today, which is far higher than the figures during the transatlantic slave trade in a given year, for example. Now, I'm not downplaying that. Obviously, you need to take into account different populations, but um, I do think this is just another subject that the woke left is profoundly dishonest about because the whole agenda is to vilify the United Kingdom as a country. And I do think that's what this is about. Um, it's not really about, looking at the past and being honest about the past. I think it's just about a very, very hard left worldview Britain is bad, because it's a Western country. It was the largest empire in history. Um, and I am so fed up with woke leftists trying to tear this country down. When the fact of the matter is, for most of the 19th century, we were the power that was acting against slavery. Um, let's just look at the whole picture. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying deny it. I'm not saying pretend it never happened. But, tearing down a statue and not looking at the whole picture is not the way to approach this. I think the way to approach it is to look at the whole picture, including African complicity, and also to look at other slave trades. If the issue is really about, if it's really a moral question, then shouldn't we look at all slave trade? Surely, no slavery is less evil than another. So why is the Barbary slave trade ignored? Um, it kind of troubles me because I think it's dishonest. Okay, I'll round this up, but I can't understand that decision. I think it sends out the wrong message. Okay, thanks for watching.